261. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 102, printed in Part A of House Report number 118-261, offered by Mr. McCormick of Georgia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 838, the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. McCormick, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. McCormick.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise to offer my amendment number 102 to H.R. 4821, the Interior and Environmental Appropriations Bill for 2024. My amendment would prohibit funds from this act from implementing President Biden's burdensome and irresponsible executive orders 14037, 14057, and 14096. Executive orders 14037 and 14057 are just more examples of Biden's administration's overreaching and out-of-touch energy regulations. The idea that the American people want the consequences of 100% of their electricity to be carbon pollution-free by 2030, 100% of the government vehicles to be zero emissions by 2035, and 50% of all new passenger cars and light trucks sold in the United States to be electric by 2030 shows just how ignorant this current administration is to the challenge of everyday Americans that are facing these problems. Now pay attention. EV popularity is waning, and it's expensive. Every day, Americans are worried about the skyrocketing cost of groceries and gas prices, or whether their next paycheck will cover all their bills, to include their electricity bill. The last thing they're thinking about is trying to afford an electrical vehicle that the Biden administration's strict standards and on average cost $17,000 more than a gas-powered vehicle. And oh, by the way, for a guy who owns a Tesla and who just had to replace a battery, that's another $17,000 on top of that. And your battery will go bad. Anybody who has a cell phone understands that. These executive orders will hurt low-income Americans most of all. The Biden administration claims to protect those people. As we look at Executive Order 14096, we see a pattern as the Biden administration chooses to focus on programs that divide the American people rather than unite us. Madam Chair, instead of simply promoting conservation efforts, which most Americans agree that are important, this administration continues to use divisive rhetoric behind environmental justice, which does not benefit the poor. Examples of this divisive rhetoric in the executive order include remnants of discrimination continue to persist today. We're talking about EV vehicles. The communities with environmental justice concerns face entrenched disparities. I tell you what, the disparities will be from those who cannot afford these very vehicles that are required. Our country needs unifying language and leadership. The Biden administration fails that test. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on my amendment number 102 to ensure that American taxpayer dollars are not being spent on frivolous and polarizing initiatives. With that, I reserve the remainder of my time.
The gentleman from Georgia reserves. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Minnesota seek recognition?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise in opposition.
Woman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm a little confused. I serve on this committee, and one of the debates that we had when we were doing the markup, and the chair probably remembers, is how in the base bill, all the money that you're talking about was stripped out. It's gone. We couldn't find offsets to put it back in, but it's gone. So the money that the gentleman's referring to is gone. $1.4 billion was taken from EG and the Inflation Reduction Act. It was taken away, so it's gone. But just getting into what we tried to do, Democrats did try to make historic investments in environmental justice, and the EPA has been able to put some of those dollars to use. But as I said, there is no EJ funding, zero, in the base bill. And it's unfortunate because I think environmental justice, as I said earlier, make sure that everybody gets the same degree of protection from environmental health hazards. Rural income communities, and the community that I grew up in that is an older suburb, but at the time was very rural, they were targeted by corporations and regulatory agencies, local planning boards and that, because the land was cheap, because the land had been polluted, and then they just kept citing more pollution around it. like landfills or waste transfer station. Oh, that's a good place to put an incinerator, garbage dumps. You know, the amount of concentration of pollution in some of these areas is really mind-boggling, because it's just, well, it's already polluted, so we could just put a little more there. And because of all that pollution in these areas, and I know you mentioned you're a doctor, so I know that you know when you're exposed to a lot of chemicals, when you're exposed to a lot of toxins, you have higher health disparities and shorter lifespans. And that's all documented. That's documented in these populations, higher cancer rates. So, as I said, the money's gone, unfortunately. I hope we can work with the Senate to put some things back. But I want my colleagues to just think for a minute that some of these communities started out with one waste facility or one toxic plant, and then another one and another one and another one came, and house values went down, and pretty soon no one wanted to live there. And in my case, in my community, it was right on the Mississippi River. So I'm a little confused, you know, talking about the funding in this bill that no longer exists, and I'm just going to reserve the balance of my time, because I think, Madam Chair, you and the members of this House know how I feel about this, and I strongly oppose this amendment.
The gentlewoman from Minnesota reserves. The gentleman from Georgia.
I appreciate you pointing out the equity of environment and your concerns for the people. Knowing the people and knowing myself, when I grew up, having to supply my own insurance, supply my own gas, supply my own car, which I bought for $1,295 for a 1971 Datsun 510 with 141,000 miles on it. I couldn't afford anything other than that. Couldn't afford any better insurance. My mom didn't have an insurance policy. Imagine a 16-year-old nowadays having their own insurance policy, not on their parents' plan. I was in survival mode, which a lot of these people that you're talking about in these communities are in. That's all they can afford. A used gas vehicle to get to their job, to be independent, to live a dignified life where they can sustain themselves. Not because they were told by the government, you will do this because I'm protecting you, but they had a choice. A choice, because we trust people more than we trust government. And isn't that what this whole argument is about? Do we trust the government to know better what's for our family and our choices, whether it be what we drive, where we work, what our emissions are? Do we trust the American people no matter what the color of their skin is? Or do we trust the American government to be the moral standard of who we are and what we represent? Who do you trust? What is equity? Is equity when the government decides everybody will be equal, or when a person has the choice based on their God-given right to self-determine, regardless of the color of skin, regardless of their gender, regardless of their religion, that they have the freedom of choice to decide their fate based on their own challenges? That's what this argument's about. Do we self-determine, or do we let the American government become our moral standard of what's right and wrong, of what's good for me? I choose the individual over the government. I believe that's the foundation of our government. I believe that's the foundation of our Constitution, and I believe that is the inalienable right that God gave us. And with that, I yield.
The gentleman yields. The gentlewoman from Minnesota.